And if you have a question, it would actually be good if you come here, and then we will give you the microphone other than... I would like to ask a question about the role of the outsider. Simplistically put, I'll put Shlomo Ben Ami, who used to be a minister in the Israeli government, vis-a-vis Alexander Downer, who gave a speech here several weeks ago. Shlomo Ben Ami, as far as I understand, says we must have an outsider coming to Israel/Palestine to make peace. Without an outsider, there will be no peace. And he actually says America must come and force the two sides. Alexander Downer said several weeks ago, I left Cyprus at a situation which was not worse than when I arrived, and I'm happy for that. In other words, an outsider cannot change. An outsider has no role. There was something rhetorical in what he said, but I'm putting it in simplistic terms. Alexander Downer, who was the UN envoy to Cyprus, says an outsider cannot help. My question to you, what do you think? Is Shlomo Ben Ami right? Is Alexander right? Or is it somewhere in between? Is there a role for an outsider?
Well, okay, thank you. I'll just hold it. I haven't heard the name Shlomo Ben Ami in a long time, but I thank you for mentioning him, because I actually, when he was running for head of the Labour Party, and he was, our great hope for the new Prime Minister, I supported him. And then when Ehud Barak became Prime Minister, Shlomo Ben Ami became Police Minister. Completely inappropriate position for him, and he did a terrible job. And although I still think he's one of our fine minds, and he could have been good in other ministries, but I think that what he did during the beginning of the Second Intifada, the so-called October riots, I think a big disappointment. So let me just say, I can take refuge in saying that I'm an educator and not a politician. I also, for a long time, thought that some third party should be involved and kind of force us. I see now the wisdom of not relying on the third party. I think that Secretary of State Kerry did just about everything in his power and failed. And I understand that many Palestinians think that because the United States is a strong ally of Israel, the United States is automatically excluded from doing anything. And I don't agree with that, but I can understand that. So I would probably say the third parties, or fourth parties even, can be catalysts. They can play a role, but ultimately it's going to be the two sides talking with each other. And here I'm going to say, one of my critiques of Oslo 20 years ago is that it was secular Palestinian men talking with secular Israeli men. And I think that for a peace process to work, there's got to be much more involvement of grassroots leadership, including religious figures, and much more involvement of women.
Do we have more questions?
Yes, so I'm going to do it here.
Okay,
We'll take you out.
it's good for my calorie.
Thank you. Deborah, do you think there's a problem inherent in the question? Can a friend of Israel also be a friend of Palestine? I say that because there are multiple identities within Israel. If we're talking about Jewish people, Christians and Muslims living together peacefully, that's been done many times, many places in history. No problem there. If we're talking about Semitic people living together, or European migrants or Russian migrants living with Semitic people, that's been done too. That's not a problem. But if you're talking about people who adhere to a Zionist ideology that accords lesser human rights to Palestinians, then the answer must be no. And the problem is, that's the dominant ideology of the Knesset as it flows through to the administration, the military, and so forth.
question. When you first began, I actually thought you were going to ask something else. So let me comment on what I thought you were going to ask, and then I'll comment on what you asked. Because I think what I thought you were going to ask is also a very important point. There are Israeli Palestinians, or Palestinian Israelis. So it's not either or. And I can tell you that in 2009, I was sent to Australia. We didn't make it to Adelaide. We were only on the East Coast. We were in Sydney and in Melbourne. A 3-person delegation from the ICCI. I went as the Jew. My friend Issa Jaber, he's now the mayor of Abu Ghosh, went as the Muslim, and a woman of Greek Orthodox tradition, Palestinian from East Jerusalem, Rula Shubeta, went as the Christian. So Issa used to begin, we went into schools and houses of worship and so on, we spoke, and Issa would begin by saying, on stage are 2 Israelis and 2 Palestinians, but you only see 3 of us. Why? Because I, Issa, am an Israeli and a Palestinian. So that's what I thought that you were asking, but it isn't. So now I want to say, in terms of the question that you asked, it all hinges on a comma. What do I mean by that? You said Zionist ideology that lessens the human rights or whatever it was of Palestinians. So is there a comma after Zionist ideology or isn't there? What do I mean by that? If there's a comma, then I would say within Zionist ideology, as I mentioned, there are many, many different approaches. You know that Martin Buber, the great humanist, was a Zionist. I consider myself a Zionist. I reject that branch of Zionist ideology that sees other people as in any way inferior. If there's no comma in that sentence, then it implies that all Zionist ideology is like that, and it isn't. As a matter of fact, when you read the statement from our Declaration of Independence, we don't yet have a constitution, I hope we will, but we do have a Declaration of Independence which has served on some occasions as a kind of a constitution, and certainly the Supreme Court often makes its decisions based on that document, and that document calls for equal rights for all, as you heard. So there's nothing that says that to be a Zionist, you necessarily have to be against anyone else. All it means is, in my opinion, that you believe in not only the right, but the importance of the Jewish people having a homeland in our ancient land of Israel. Not necessarily in all the ancient land of Israel, but in part of it. I think that that can go along with the belief that the Palestinian people have a right to their homeland. Both sides are nations that have a right of self-determination. Okay? I think those 2 rights can be reconciled. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I believe in what's called 2 states for 2 peoples.
Deborah, thanks very much for coming to talk to us tonight. I really enjoyed your presentation, and something that I've been struck as a student of European history is that, unfortunately, contrary to what has been suggested, historically Christians and Jews haven't been able to live together because of the terrible tradition Christians have of declaring pogroms and denying Jews' rights. And I think in regards to what you're speaking about and the idea of reconciliation, I'm very interested in the role that your council has come to the conclusion about the role that Christians play in the reconciliation process, and perhaps indeed the responsibility for the modern state of Israel and the Middle East, and whether people of Christian faith have a lot more work to do in terms of making reparation.
That's a great Thank you so much for that question. Okay. So, again, I'm going to answer on two levels. First of all, I want to say something about European history. I take some hope in the fact that up until fairly recently, England, France, and Germany were terrible enemies, fighting for hundreds of years. Before that, by the way, Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians were fighting bloody wars. And now, they work together. They're friends, they're allies. So that gives me some hope for the future in our part of the world. And even though we're fighting terribly and, victimizing each other and so on, Alavai, I say, inshallah, we should become like those countries that today, you know what? The Swedes and the Norwegians, I just came from Norway a few months ago, they tell jokes about each other. They're not wild about each other. Both groups like the Danes, but neither one of them likes each other. Oh, if we could only reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a question of jokes, wow, wouldn't that be amazing? By the way, Palestinians tell jokes about people from Hebron. It's like, if any of you know, there's a Jewish tradition about people in Chelm. Okay, well, the Palestinians have the same kind of stories about the Hebron. El Khalili, I think they call it. Anyway. So you know what, jokes? Let's tell jokes. Okay. Now the second part of your question is about Christians. And here, I want to say, why am I in Australia this week? Because I was brought by the Australian Catholic University of Melbourne for a conference that's starting next Monday on interreligious dialogue. And I think the conference is in preparation for the 50th anniversary of a very important document called Nostra Aetate from the Second Vatican Council. Okay? You know that just recently there were two popes who became saints. Pope John XXIII, Pope John Paul II. Well, Jews all over the world saw John Paul II as a hero, and he was, I'm not denying that. I'm not sure we've given enough credit to Pope John XXIII. He had a very short papacy. Unfortunately, he died, and his role was taken over by Pope Paul VI. But it was Pope John's idea to convene the Second Vatican Council. After having met a French Jewish historian called Jules Isaac, who talked to him about something called the teaching of contempt within the Catholic Church, or within Christianity, actually. It's not just the Catholics. So I agree that if we're looking historically at the Crusades and the Inquisition and the pogroms, Christians have a record not to be proud of. But I just said metanoia, transformation. I think that many of the Christian churches, beginning with the Roman Catholics and continuing through many of the Protestant denominations, the Orthodox, it's a little more complex. There's certainly individuals who are Orthodox Christians who are absolutely committed to dialogue and tolerance and so on. I'm not sure if all the church leadership is, but it's a process. I think that those Christians have given us a wonderful role model of metanoia, of transformation. So today, I see Christians as very strong allies in many, many parts of the world. Now, one of the sad facts about the Middle East today is that the presence of Christians is diminishing. Not in Israel. In Israel, local Christians are more or less stabilized at about 2% of the population. Other non-Arab Christians are increasing in Israel, whether they come from the former Soviet Union, the Philippines, Romania, other places. But in the surrounding countries, not only is their presence diminishing, but sometimes there are atrocities committed against Christians. And that's very, very sad. It's sad when anybody is persecuted on any level. And I think it's also sad because the Christians have a very close historical tie with that region of the world, and their presence is important. So here, I think, one of the goals of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel should be to reach out and try to strengthen the Christian population, both the local Christians and the Christians who came from other places and are now trying to integrate into the society.
I think there's a lot of talk at the start that we should respect each other's opinion, and so I'd like you to take what I'm going to say in this context. In my view, you are part of the problem. In my view, that by coming in here and presenting some sort of rosy pictures about you meeting with the Bishop and all personally, this will solve the conflict, is flawed in the extreme. In fact, you have said that you're a Zionist, and then what you're doing is just advancing the course of Zionism. Today, when there is 1.4 million people in this village, today, when Palestine is still under occupation, today, Palestine is under occupation. Only yesterday, on the 15th, 2 young kids were shot dead, on range, on blood. 1,500 trees were put on fire, and so on and so on. My point is not to list all the atrocities, and they are available. The picture you presented does not in any way give any, in my view, with respect to you, respect to what's really happening on the ground. Now, there's a couple of things I'd like to also note. You said that after Oslo, that the grassroots did not actually buy the peace process, but I disagree. Actually, I was living in Israel between 1993 and 2000, and I know well, even in my village, how much reconciliation was happening with other Jews in the moshavs and other places around. So it's not true that it is the grassroots that rejected peace. It was more of Ehud Barak and Bibi Netanyahu, edged on by the neocons in the US. It says you don't have to sign a peace deal, you got to be it. Until the streets boiled in 2000 and the Second Intifada started. The last point I want to say, and you could figure out now that I'm an Israeli citizen of Arab descent, I think it's also an insult to say that Israel is a democracy. I think what Edward Said said comes through Israel's democracy with the Jews and apartheid for the Arabs. I have a really long list of things that describe the discrimination against Palestinians, and there's no way there are any clause to how Australia treats its Aboriginal people. There's no specific laws that discriminate against indigenous people in here. There is no differences in the allocation of funding. If anything, Aborigines are given more funding to bring them to solve their health problems, education problems, and so on. Now, Israel did make some changes, and things are improving, but very, very slowly, I have to say. And even when a NGO like Adala, which tried to put a constitution to actually treat all Israeli citizens as equal, it was met with almost a violent reaction from the Shin Bet chief, saying that he would not hesitate to use undemocratic means to...
I don't hear who you're quoting.
This is the head of the Shin Bet at the time, I can't remember his name. But that they will use undemocratic means to actually stop anybody who's trying to change the Jewish character of Israel. And I took my time. In other words, what they were calling for is, Israel be a state of its citizens. Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you for the question. I have a number of points that I'd like to make.